Hi everyone, it's Lindsay and today I'm here to share with you how I layered up some inks and stamps for added dimension and depth on one of my cards today. So I'm going to be using this brand new stamp set from Joy Claire Stamps, and it's called Springtime Flowers. I am using the tulip from this stamp set, and I'm going to be using this black dye ink here for some quick drying. Now I have die cut a piece of watercolor paper, so it's a rectangle, and I'm going to be using another layer behind this. So I've used a die set that layers well just to cut out this rectangle ahead of time. So I'm starting in the center of this panel, and I am just stamping this tulip. I'll stamp it 5 times once I'm all done with everything. So I started in the very center, and now I'm going to move to the right. I'm using my mini MISTI so I can stamp these quickly and double stamp since I am stamping on watercolor paper. Now, I am not making these straight up and down. Sometimes I'm tilting them to the right, sometimes to the left, just to give them a little bit of a different look, since I am using the same stamp all the way across the card. So now I've went on to the left hand side. Now I'm back to the right hand side. This one's going to hang off the panel a little bit. That's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and place that one down. And again, these are not straight across from each other. One is up higher than the other one. That's okay. That's how I want it. I'm going to make a grounding effect later, so that's how I want this to look. Now I've had to switch my paper over to the right hand side of my MISTI here because I need to stamp on the left hand side of my panel, and I need it to hang off that side as well, the same way it did on the right hand side. So I went ahead and shifted my paper over, and I am using my mini MISTI horizontally just to accommodate my paper size. So if you have your mini MISTI, don't feel like you're limited to just using it the vertical way. You can switch this around and use it horizontally, and that way you can fit a bigger piece of paper in there. So now I've got all of my tulip stamps, so I'm using a micron pen. This is a waterproof pen because I am going to be doing some watercoloring, so I needed a waterproof ink and a waterproof pen to make this grounding effect. And I am just connecting all of those little stems down at the very bottom to create a nice little ground. Now I'm not making straight lines, I'm making sort of wonky lines here because no ground is perfectly straight, so I went with a more realistic look. Now I'm going to be using some of my distress inks just to watercolor in this scene very quickly. So for my ground, instead of green, I'm going to be using some brown to resemble dirt, and then I'll be using some blues for my sky area. Now I am going to be working in sections. I want this to look all interconnected, so I've mixed up quite a bit of blue here, and I'm going to be working in sections. So I've started on the left hand side of my panel. I've went in those 2 smallest sections, and then I started down at the bottom, and I'm working my way up, and I'm continually working on the wet area of the paper and connecting that wet area to more of the area that needs to be filled in. And this is going to allow me to get a very flat look with my watercolor, so I don't have any overlapping areas. So when you're working with a big area like this and you want that nice wash look, you need to work quickly, you need to work in sections, and you need to continue to work in the areas that are wet. If I go back and I try and touch up a dry area over on the left hand side now, it's going to look weird. It's going to get that splotchy look, and that's not what I was going for here. So once I was finished with that sky, I went ahead and just mixed up a little bit of green with some mowed lawn, and I'm filling in all of those leaves and stems. Now this is going to blend a little bit with that brown as it touches it, but that's okay. It kind of gives it a more blended look right down at the bottom, and it doesn't move very much. So I went ahead and filled in all of those, and for the actual flowers, I'm going to leave those just plain white, and I'll show you how I cover these up in just a moment. So I went ahead and picked out some pastel colors just to scrap pieces of paper. I've got a pink and a yellow, green, purple, and blue, and I am just going to stamp with that same black dye ink the top of the flower right onto each one of these little scraps of paper that I have. And you can see you don't need a very big scrap, maybe an inch by an inch piece of scrap paper. So you can really use anything here. You can use pattern paper if you wanted to here. That'd be really pretty as well. But once I had all of those stamped out, I'm just going to fussy cut around each one of these flowers. And I'm just using that top part. I'm not using any portion of the stem or leaves or anything like that, just the actual flower itself. Then, once I have them all fussy cut out, it doesn't take very long to do this, just a little bit of patience is all. Once I had them all cut out, I'm going to come in with some distress inks. So I've picked out coordinating distress inks for all of the colors of paper beforehand, just to make sure that I had a color to match the paper I was using. So for the blue, I'm using the same blue that I used in the sky, which is Salty Ocean, and I am just roughly going around the edges. I'm not blending on at all of the flower. I'm just using that little bit of ink that's on my sponge to darken up the edges, and this is going to give those fussy cut images a little bit more depth, a little bit more color, and it's going to look like I actually hand colored them in, but all I did was add this little bit of ink around the edges. I used a little bit of the purple, I believe it's Wilted Violet, I'm not sure of the actual color, I'll put it in the description box below. But I used that on the purple. I'm using some mustard seed on the yellow, and you can see all of these colors match the cardstock very well. So I'm not adding a lot more of a deeper color or a lighter color or anything like that. It matches very well. It's just enough to kind of wet the paper and give it a little bit of a darker shadowed look. Now I'm using crushed olive on the green, and again just brushing that right along the edges of that flower. And then for the pink one, I'm going to be using some worn lipstick for that one as well. And you can see off to the right hand side, before I bring my sponge to the paper, I'm actually blotting off a whole lot extra of that ink. So it's not getting a ton of ink on the flowers themselves. And this was a fresh sponge, so I did kind of condition it a little bit, so I dipped it in the ink a few more times and blotted it off a few more times just to get that new sponge a little bit more conditioned. Once I had all of those done, these are fussy cut images, so I like to take my distress marker, this is a black soot, and just go around all of those edges to darken them up. I like to use my distress marker because it is water-based, so it doesn't bleed into the fibers of the paper. If I do this with an alcohol marker or anything like that, it's going to bleed into the fibers of the paper, your lines get bigger, I don't like the look of it. So I like to use my distress marker for this, but any water-based marker will do. And finally, to these flowers, I'm going to add one more layer, and that is this Shimmer Spritz from Imagine Crafts. This is the color Frost. You do need to shake it up quite a bit, and I actually have a box that I'm going to spray these in. So I just hold it a little ways above these flowers and give them a nice spritz of this, and this gives it a nice sheen and shine, a little bit of a droplet effect on it as well, depending on how close I hold it, and it doesn't take very long to dry on there at all. Now I'm just adding a little bit of fun foam to the back of each flower with some double-sided adhesive, and then I'm just going to place those right on top of those flowers on the actual panel that I left white. Now beforehand I did have those flowers that were hanging off the left and the right hand side of the panel. Normally I would trim these flowers down, and I thought about it, cutting them flush with that panel, but for this particular card I actually like the look of them hanging off. So I'm just going to leave them whole and let them hang off the side of that. It gives a nice effect, especially once I get this white panel layered up onto this craft scalloped rectangle panel that I die cut as well. So I put some double-sided adhesive on the back of that watercolor panel, and then I'll just place this right down onto this craft scallop panel, and this just adds another layer to my card. But even when I do use a lot of layers, I don't like a lot of added dimension. This is just one way to do a lot of layers on your card without all that bulk. So one more layer I'm going to put on this panel is I'm going to be using some Versamark ink. I have treated my paper with my embossing bag, and I stamped that Hello sentiment right on the bottom right hand corner directly on that panel. And I'm going to be using some Wow embossing powder that's a black sparkle, and I heat set that for another added layer on top of this panel. So I've got all this dimension, all these layers, but not a whole lot of bulk to this card, so it will still go through the mail very easily. Now I'm just going to pop this panel right up onto an A2 side folding card base. Now this card base is a little bit too big for that panel, so I like to just make it right with two of the sides, and then I bring that panel or the card base right to my paper trimmer and just trim the other two sides down so it's all even. And that finished off my card for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video tutorial and adding all these layers to a card without adding all that bulk and dimension. As always, I will leave you guys with a few pictures of the finished card. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a few different options you can click on. The very top will take you to a video that you might enjoy watching next. The bottom right will subscribe you to my channel if you're not already. And the bottom left will actually take you to the supply list for this card over on my blog. Thank you guys so much for watching and happy crafting.